speakers or panelists will have 15 minutes, okay, to deliver his speech. And at the end of all presentations, the audience will be allowed 15 minutes to ask any question. Okay, that's right. The panelists, if want, can share PowerPoints. Okay, I hope that you know use this platform, but it's very easy. Okay. Well, because time is short, 2 hours for 5 panelists, we can begin, okay? And let's begin with Dr. Zachary Kramer, okay? Dr. Zachary Kramer from Charles University, who will lecture us on stack integration and fsQCA of constrained transition states. Through the abstract that I read, I think that the results of this study suggest that realist conditions have influenced transition processes in the group of states identified by the author. Dr. Zachary, please.
Thank you very much, Nancy. That's right. I'm Zachary Kramer from Charles University here in Prague, Czech Republic. Very sad that I wasn't able to join you down in Lisbon, but anyway, we will press on here. So I'm going to go ahead and if everyone can hear me, okay, is that coming through all right? Yeah, okay. I'll go ahead and share my screen then. Hopefully that will be visible to everyone. So. And that's working okay?
That's right.
All right, thank you very much. I'll go ahead and get started then. So yes, as our host mentioned, my article is entitled "Stuck in the Gray Zone: A Fuzzy Set Qualitative Comparative Analysis of Constrained Transition States." And we're going to get into a little bit about what that means. This article is maybe a little bit methodologically complex with this QCA method that most people are understandably not that familiar with, but we're going to focus on the substantive outcomes here to try to make this more interesting for everyone. So, as I'm sure all of you are aware, in the starting in really 1989 and then through the 1990s, a very large group of countries in both Europe and the former Soviet Union entered processes of post-communist transitions, and according to most people, these are still going on, and at least some of these countries, if not all of them. So the dominant theoretical literature on transition since that time has been liberal institutionalism, which tends to assume a linear process. Once a country's communist government ends, it begins some process of liberalization. And this takes place through institutional development and the establishment and improvement of a country's institutions, and that basically this is how a country goes through transition, and that all countries that are no longer authoritarian communist governments are going through transition in some form, maybe at different speeds, maybe at different rates of success, but basically they're all moving towards the same goal, moving in the same direction. This was the dominant literature in this field for a long time, and arguably still is, although it maybe doesn't have quite the stranglehold on the literature that it once did. 30 years later, we see that of the 29, so the 15 post-Soviet countries and then 14 in the former Yugoslavia, Central and Eastern Europe that I've identified for this study, 12 of them are identified as semi-democracies by Freedom House, partly free. in their terminology. So these are neither consolidated authoritarian states nor consolidated democracies. They're somewhere in between. Maybe they have elements of democracy, but are not really all the way there yet, so to speak. And surprisingly, this group also has a significantly lower average income level than either democracies or dictatorships, which is sort of a puzzle for this liberal institutionalist literature, which basically assumed that not only would this, 30 years later, we would anticipate that most of these countries would already have really kind of consolidated some form of democracy and integrated their market economies into the global economy and achieved high levels of income, relatively high levels of income, maybe especially those that are in Europe, surrounded by other wealthy countries. But that, in fact, we see that there's been rather different results. So my question here is, can institutionalism, an institutionalist paradigm as introduced by Thomas Carruthers, really account for this enduring puzzle posed by these semi-democracies and their persistence through time? Or are they really stuck in the gray zone, as Carruthers termed it, somewhere in between democracy and authoritarianism? And do we need a new approach to understand what's going on in these countries? So this diagram, I don't know if you can see. Okay, I'll keep moving this chat thing around, or this video thing around here. Okay, so this is a little on my case selection here. This shows the acronyms for all of the different post-communist countries under study here. Some of them may be more clear than others. But and then they're organized. So this is income here on the left in dollars per capita per year, and their Freedom House score down below. So the lower the score, the more democratic the country, and the higher the score, the more authoritarian. I think it's pretty clear that there's this kind of distinct group right in the middle here. We've got Serbia, Albania, Georgia, Moldova, North Macedonia, Kosovo, Ukraine, Bosnia, Armenia, and then Kyrgyzstan at a somewhat lower income level. Montenegro is sort of somewhere in between Hungary, which is a clear outlier here, and then Serbia. And then we have this, wealthy, democratized group, and this kind of mixed, although not clearly not poor, authoritarian group over here way on the right. So I'm interested in this subgroup down here right in the middle and trying to explain what's going on with them. So my research question in this study is, what conditions or combinations of conditions explain the pattern of persistent semi-democratic middle-income transition outcomes among multiple European and former Soviet Union post-communist transition countries? What explains the persistence of that group through time? I guess I should have mentioned that none of these countries here in this middle group have really ever left the middle group. They basically got there soon after the end of communism and have stayed there. There's been very few success stories of moving out of that group or of reaching really high income levels. So my reasoning here is that because liberal institutionalism has provided a somewhat insufficient set of explanations for these outcomes, we ought to look perhaps to realism, institutionalism's main rival in international relations and political economy. Realism allows for the incorporation of ideas like conflict, power, and dependency into its research. It can challenge liberal institutions' teleological assumption that all these countries are sort of moving in the same direction in terms of liberalization. And we can use realism to theorize what I call a constrained transition state, in which there are liberalizing domestic factors, things like pro-Western governments, trade deals with Europe, IMF conditionality programs, things that would be pushing countries in a liberalizing direction that are supported or being engaged in domestically. But then there are also status quo preserving factors that really push in the opposite direction, many of which are located outside of the country that's engaged in the transition process, although not exclusively outside. And that these factors are often bound up with power relations and economic dependencies and these other counter forces that would tend to push countries in the opposite direction of liberalization, both politically and economically, and would perhaps explain the persistence of this middle-income semi-democratic status. So to answer this question, I used what is called fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis, in which you take a set of cases. So for me, these 29 post-communist countries, and then measure them across different conditions. which mirror independent variables in other research methods, and then one outcome of interest, the dependent variable, which in this case is this constrained transition or semi-democratic middle income status. And then for the other variables, each case is coded as either true or false for those conditions. So you end up with a sort of big table of information about different criteria, which are either true or false across different cases, and on which basis those cases can then be compared, hence comparative analysis. So this method uses set theory instead of statistical relationships. So it would maybe find something that, like, all cases with condition A show outcome Y, rather than that there's a statistically significant relationship between two things. Fuzzy set QCA, which this study uses, allows multiple values between true and false. For purposes of time, we won't get into that too much, but that's what that fuzzy set means, is that it can be, there's a little bit of wiggle room between the absolutes there. And then finally, this allows for identification of complex conjunctions of causal factors in examining an outcome in not necessarily a better or worse way than case studies or regression analysis, but definitely a different one that you can just sort of take a different look at everything. So to return to this graph, this shows sort of the case selection process for the countries of interest with this outcome. Those in the lower box are coded as fully in the set of constrained transition countries. And then because they have the lowest income levels that are in the semi-democratic group. And then we become less interested in these outcomes as they move up in income level, because they're more in line with what liberal transition theory would expect, that in fact these are kind of upper middle income countries as we move up, or they move towards that. So we're most interested in the ones in the blue, yellow, and red boxes, and then less interested in Montenegro and Hungary, where, as we can see, they sort of follow this pattern of slightly declining income levels as levels of democracy decrease, a pattern which then just sort of totally breaks down right in the middle there. So this chart shows, this is the institutional variables that I wanted to test, as well as the dependent variable, just to give some idea of how these are sort of incorporated into the model. So the constrained transitional variable is like the dependent variable and uses these definitions and sources of data. Then the other variables here are institutional development, using different statistical indicators, energy exports, and favorable institutional legacies prior to the fall of communism. And then these are incorporated in the same model with the realist variables that I wanted to add, or to sort of use to provoke this, this liberal hypothesis. So these involve unresolved conflict between two powers, whether or not there's still an unresolved conflict going on for a country, a trade dependence, which is measured on the basis of how much of a country's trade comes from a regional power. And for these purposes, the regional powers are treated as Russia for nearly all the countries, and then Serbia for the former Yugoslavia. Sort of debatable whether or not Serbia is truly a regional power, but anyway, they have some kind of legacy position there as a result of being sort of the successor state to Yugoslavia. And then finally, popular overthrow of government, what are known in most of the relevant cases here as color revolutions, whether or not they went through one of those during the period of independence. So this model produced some interesting results. We find that there were two necessary conditions for the outcome, a lack of energy exports and a lack of favorable institutional legacies. So all of these countries in this group of interest show these two phenomena, but these conditions were not sufficient for membership in the group. We also find other countries, especially in the authoritarian group, that show these outcomes as well, or these conditions as well. So there were three different conjunctions of conditions that were sufficient for membership in this group. The first was having low institutional development and having an unresolved conflict and a politically compromising trade dependency, which we saw in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Moldova. Then there was having low institutional development and having had a color revolution, Albania and Kyrgyzstan. And finally, there was institutional development, but having undergone, note here, high institutional development, not low, but having had a color revolution and having an unresolved conflict, which we see in Armenia, Georgia, Serbia, and to some extent in Ukraine. Ukraine has a little bit lower institutional development level than these other three countries, but still conform most closely to this pattern. So I found these results interesting. What do these mean? This to me suggested that we can see sort of three different pathways to how countries get stuck in this middle zone. There's one that I called the constrained democratization pathway, which we see in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Moldova. All of these countries have been characterized by what I call congenital conflicts since their independence that are now peaceful, that are now quiet, but are still basically unresolved. Bosnia is sort of right on the line between resolved and unresolved, but I think most people would agree that it's still essentially in a post-conflict situation. And they're small economies that can't break their communist era economic ties. And so you just see that these factors really have led to them kind of being stuck, even though these are in sort of different geographical regions with different legacies, they're all kind of in a similar position. Then there's the constrained authoritarianization pathway in Albania and Kyrgyzstan, where it's sort of the opposite, or well, not the opposite, but anyway, we see very poor institutional conditions in these countries, especially at the breakup of communism and very, very low income levels and kind of difficult foreign relations positions and difficult political legacies, all of which would have predicted that these countries would move towards authoritarianism. But both of them experienced overthrows of government, Kyrgyzstan twice in 2005 and 2010, Albania in the middle 90s, I believe. The key points in their histories that prevented authoritarianization. But because of that low level of institutional development, we also see that these countries are still a long way from full democratization at the same time. And then finally, there's what I would call the dually constrained pathway, where you see that there are tendencies both towards democratization and authoritarianization that then are blocked or constrained by counterforces. And you see these countries going both ways. All of these countries have unresolved conflicts now, with the most recent addition being Ukraine with the Crimea conflict, and also have had color revolutions of some form, but also have relatively high levels of institutional development. So the institutional development alone would predict that these countries would be upper middle income or upper income democracies, but they're not. They're stuck. But then whenever they get too far towards authoritarianization, you see color revolutions. So they're sort of stuck on both sides by various factors. And this is perhaps the most interesting group because it's kind of the most direct challenge to institutional theory. It's more or less a contradiction of what outcomes it would expect. So to move on to the last part of the discussion here, the overall results suggest that the biggest factor in these outcomes is unresolved conflict. We see this in 7 out of 10 of these constrained transition cases, and only in 2 of 19 cases outside of the constrained transition group, which are Russia and Serbia, these sort of successor powers that have these unresolved territorial claims, more or less, within the kind of realm of their influence or former influence. The only case of those 10 that did not fit one of those 3 pathways that I outlined in the previous slide was North Macedonia, which may be then the least constrained in this group. It certainly has problems of its own, but North Macedonia does not have an unresolved conflict, does not have any politically compromising trade dependencies, and hasn't faced color revolutions. So they may see their transitional progress most closely determined by their institutional development alone out of any country in this group. And finally, that we observe kind of novel groupings of countries that are not usually compared in general in these results. I thought that was one of the most interesting things. For example, I've never really seen any discussion of the parallels between Albania and Kyrgyzstan's transition processes in literature. But in fact, the more that I read about them, I found that there were indeed good grounds for comparing them. The same could also be said of the other groups, but I think with this pair, it was especially clear. So my conclusions are: of 10 semi-democracies with incomes below $7,500, that was the cutoff point chosen in the study, all but one fit into 3 distinctive conjunctions of realist and institutional variables. again, this wasn't meant to completely throw out these institutional variables, but rather to examine the way that they combined with realist factors to produce outcomes that were different than what institutional factors alone would predict. So we see the constrained democratization pattern, the constrained authoritarianization pattern, the dually constrained patterns in the combinations of these variables that we observe. The combination of these conditions from realist and institutional theory explain constrained transition outcomes better than institutional conditions alone would, especially in the dually constrained cases where you have high institutional development, but kind of mediocre or weak transition outcomes. Another important finding was that I think it could be argued that constrained transition, this gray zone, middle state, is not stagnation. A lot of times you'll see articles with headlines like "stuck in transition" or stagnation in transit, whatever, in this region or something like that, suggesting that nothing is going on or that it's all just sort of a preservation of the status quo. But I think really what we see instead is that there's a great deal going on in these countries. There are wars, there are new trade deals, there are elections, there are changes in government. There's maybe more going on in this group than there is in the authoritarian group in some way, but that these forces counterbalance and counteract each other, leading to what appear to be kind of consistent status quo preserving outcomes, but in fact are really complex, that there are transitions happening in these countries, but that they're sort of two-sided, or that there's a push and pull effect. And then finally, to wrap up here, I found that many post-communist countries may continue to be stuck in this semi-democratic gray zone until they resolve these unresolved conflicts and also diversify trade away from these politically compromising relationships, regardless of their institutional factors. So just for instance, it might not matter how much a country like Ukraine reduces its level of corruption in terms of its transition progress, as much as it would matter just how soon it can get out of this conflict that it's in with Russia and bring a resolution to that about. Just as one example, but that of course can be extended to many other countries as well. So just to wrap up here are some of the major sources for this. We don't have time to go through these, but if anybody's interested, I can certainly send these to you. Yeah, I will finish up here, and so sorry for going a little bit over the time there. I hope that's all right. But yeah, I'll look forward to anybody's questions, or if anybody would like to know more about QCA as a method, feel free to contact me outside of the Zoom format here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zachary Kramer.
Not yet, still master.
Okay, master. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, because the next panelist, Dr. Dmytro, Khutkyy, and Kristina Avramchenko. Okay. Dr. Dmytro have to go out. He or they are the next. Okay, Marina, can you wait, please? Okay, thank you. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, Dr. Dmytro come from Malmo University, and Kristina Avramchenko is an independent expert, and they will now speak about social political impact of participatory budgeting in Ukraine. Okay, through the abstract, we can observe important results. This study had the purpose to evaluate the social political impact on local communities, about 136 in Ukraine. Please, Dr. Dmytro, can you?
For the next introduction, I'll try to share screen with the PowerPoint.
It's no, okay. You can begin.
Okay, I'll try. So, do you see it? Great, wonderful. So, I'll tell you about the idea. The point is that participatory budgeting, it's like very emancipative, empowering democratic process, which originated in Brazil in 1989, so almost 30 years ago. And they really wanted to start like local development by engaging residents. So they experimented a lot and developed this scheme, which means that first they set up the institutions, how it works, then they brainstorm what they want to develop, like renovate a school or a road, or maybe make a new like 3D modeling class, or like bicycle route, or build a stadium, or make a festival. And then when they get all these ideas and priorities, people have like proposals and they vote. And the key empowering point is that when citizens vote, it's mandatory for authorities to implement. So it's really direct, participatory, democratic design. And ideally, public officials, they implement this afterwards. In some cases, if it's really a small community, citizens may do it themselves. Or maybe it's like artistic work, like a statue, and the author will design it that way. So this is like ideal model. It works in a bit different way, different stages, but citizens should have like some power. They should have their oversight, monitoring capabilities. They should come to authorities and check what's going on, and authorities should report. So there should be like transparency. Everything's clear, what's going on, participation and accountability. And we wanted to check how this works in Ukraine, because maybe it's like a fake thing, maybe like local city council or many like local oligarchs, they just use this thing to channel money, public money to their own projects, and you know, just renovate roads using public funds. That would be really wrong. Maybe it's really empowering and everything works. So in Ukraine, it's working for 4 years and wanted to see what's the impact. So the theory behind that, there's like a whole theory that it should have a lot of influence. I synthesize this from different sources, like how it should work, how it did work in Brazil and other places. And it should have improved the quality of life in all different spheres, depending on the type of projects. It should impact local residents, but making them more active, more educated, more united, having more freedoms and opportunities to impact local governance. And of course, it should influence local authorities in the way that they interact with citizens. They develop their capabilities of dealing with such innovative designs. They know better what citizens want, and they're able to implement it. So ideally, there's like a whole cloud of positive influences. So how this works in the world? This is like a pretty old scheme. So now it's, but proportions are pretty much the same. So there's a lot in South America because it's originated there, and only in 2000s, World Bank, United Nations, they promote this globally. So there are more cases in Europe, many of them Asia, Northern America, Africa. Over 50 countries do practice participatory budgeting, including 20 in Europe. In Ukraine, so from 2015 to 19, there was 4 years, and reportedly there's like 200 of communities we, like me and my colleague Kristina, we found over 140 communities, and we wanted to study them, like overall, like the total like baseline or like evaluation estimation. So how did we do that? We sent official requests, freedom of information request, all these public officials, and received like almost from 90% of them more or less fine requests with some data. Not everything was exhaustive, but there was a lot of data. Then we, among these communities, we chose 9. So we understood that, for example, community size will matter, because in small communities it's easy to engage people, in larger it's more difficult. So we divided them like million size settlements, 100,000 people, and like 10,000. And within those 3 clusters, we took like the highest participation rate, the lowest participation, and their median. Medium, it's like statistical median size. So it was like contrast sample, like if they're in socio-political aspect, the key outcome be participation. People are engaged, then it means something is going on well, something is going a lot. So in terms of participation, what percentage of people vote for these cases? We chose like the highest, lowest, and the median. And we had an interview with them, at least 2 in each community, one with official, one with civic activists, sometimes more. So what did you find? We found that usually they allocate not much, less than 1% of total budget. If you take like development budget, it would be like around 1%. So like, because you can't, like in theory, you can allocate from all budget more, but usually need to keep the government running. There were lots of female authors, more than half of them on average. In some cases, there were 90%, 100% female authors. It's really engaging women. In almost all cases, there were people who voted, and it was binding. But in some cases, there were commissions of officials, and that's not good, because that's not really democratic. Then it's kind of representative democracy. It's like distorting the whole idea. But they found only 2 cases like that, so it's not much. The biggest variation is the percentage of those who voted. So it can be like almost 0 to almost half of residents in a village. Yeah, there was a village when like almost every second person voted. Implementation rates are pretty high for Ukraine, 88%, given that sometimes it's inefficient, sometimes you don't have enough money. Of course, it's not 100 as it should be. Some of these are just postponed, some of these are not done well. But the really good point in political economic sense is that authorities allocate more money. Usually they give like half more. So they see some value in it, otherwise they would not do it. Just to get some ideas how it's going on, like the Kyiv, the capital, participation rate is 4.5% of the whole population of 5 million. And why did it happen? Because there was really good collaboration between citizens and authorities. They already practiced e-petitions before that, so they developed, trust and openness, and had negotiation. It was pretty efficient. So when they wanted to introduce participatory budgeting, it was just extra step, more responsibility, more funds, but they were ready to do that. Good information campaign, very few conflicts in town. So there's like positive cycle of trust, it's working. Dmytro has like medium percentage. And what we found is that they had a change of implementing teams in the government, and it changed twice. So first they introduced it with help like of this Polish development authority, which, because they have lots of cases in Poland, and it worked well. Then there was a change of political power, like a different mayor came. They changed the team of implementers, and in the middle of a cycle. So authors didn't even know whom to call to, whom to talk to, and new people need to develop capabilities. And then they turned the original team back partially. So it was like a whole lot of confusion. So they did something, but not as much. Odessa has like the lowest of million size cities. Why? Well, there's a definitely a problem with trust because they do not disclose the number of people who voted or only the number of votes. And when people submit like scans of their passports, like in theory, this is what some people claim, authorities can use those documents for extra votes. Like, so there is some distrust towards authorities, like they don't know, is it fair or not? And I think it's participation in medium-sized communities, like Lviv has almost 10% of citizens who vote. It's a lot for this like big city like that, and it's from the whole population, including like children. So for adults, it'd be even more. Why is that? Because Lviv is really innovative. They want like to boast. They implement things, new things, and have kind of an entrepreneurial mindset. So if you check surveys, you'll see that people are really proactive in town. Zaporizhia, it has like medium success rate. Well, it's a big city. They have some issues with communication campaign, but it worked fine. In Kramatorsk, they also had a change of teams, but not in authorities, but the administrators of online platform, because there was like one society team which introduced this online voting space, and then there was a different one. But then again, all these disagreements, and it's not working good for the process. In small communities, there's like almost a quarter of people who voted, also a really good sign. And why is that? It turned out that that settlement, they're already active in other spheres. So they apply for United Nations grants, they are doing lots of development projects. So it was like just the next step. They already have the capabilities to do that in the first place. Khmelnyk and Cherkiv are similar in a way that they'd had problems with outreach, so they didn't promote that among the population well. This is why people weren't aware that they can vote, can choose projects, can submit them. Then it became better. So later years showed some improvement. So to wrap up, what we can learn from this? First of all, there is this experimental democracy design. So you don't know at the beginning how it worked best. So it's really good to have some space for experimentation and change regulations each year, review them and introduce new practices, learn from other experiences, other cases, international programs. Pretty much this is democratic. People do vote directly, suggest projects, sometimes implement. But the model is different from Brazil because in Brazil, people would set up their priorities first. Should it be like education, or should it be healthcare, or should it be infrastructure, and then develop projects within this. In Ukraine, for some reason, it became more entrepreneurship model. So authors offer whatever they want, they advertise it, people vote. So it's like who has reached more people wins. It gives more flexibility, but it also might deviate from like priorities if you think about them deeper. Almost all positive effects were observed. Increased quality of life, citizens' activism, quality of self-governance. Apart from two effects, we didn't see much inclusion raising, so maybe it wasn't a focus. Maybe it needs like extra effort to make projects really inclusive. And we didn't see better community cohesion, maybe because of lack of deliberation, because like some cities were really big, so it's hard to get people together, although they can meet in small neighborhoods, but maybe there is a fact we just didn't find it in the data. what's really important, like we're trying to look at factors in the actual regression analysis on data we had, and we didn't find like a really much statistical significant impact, like apart from obviously size, which you can't affect. What you potentially might affect, and which is, it's not like statistical significant, but it's just an ordinal correlation using some survey data, is that cities with highest participation are the ones where people demonstrate proactive attitudes, like self-awareness, self-directedness, overall control, high control of their life. And it's logical, you know, if they have this mindset, then they implement it in practice. Overall, we also see the digital, right, and it really matters that authorities are open. So if authorities are open, people are active, and there is dialogue between them, then it works. If one of these key pieces is missing, it's not working. So either citizen distrust or authorities like sabotage, or they can't agree on things. But if three things combined, really good chances it will work. We see the digitalization, so they're slowly moving from like paper to mixed paper, digital voting to 100% online voting, like in Kyiv. So electronic democracy is rolling. And what we can learn from this and recommend. So it's a really good idea to involve all stakeholders, because otherwise people might feel left behind and, you know, just quarrel later. So it's really good to talk to people when you design this, like the whole regulation, the whole process, that you listen to people, that you let them have a say, let them influence the format. It's also good to institutionalize. It's not very well when it's only like oral agreements, because, you know, people come and go, political situation changes. So it's really good to have everything on paper, written. And so if you have like people who want to do that, and regulations and practice, then it works. It's really important to discuss what are the priorities, how it should be done, what are the challenges. This really helps. If everything works well and you have results, it's good to communicate this to people, because sometimes there are like renovated parks, but people don't know that these were done through participatory budgeting. And this is sad, because that's an effect that people don't know, but they find out, wow, this helped. I voted for this, and this is amazing. So really tell what's going on. Keep it transparent, like digitally, online, all stages, present, tell, building trust, let people engage and report. And so authorities should be responsive on one thing, and citizens should be also active on their side. And finally, there is a chance to scale up, to disseminate it further, like we have this regional participatory budgeting. We are experimenting with participatory budgeting in schools, youth PB, and finally there are some like discussions to make it nationwide, like projects. Citizens of the whole country will vote for project for the whole state. That would be next step. So there are lots of possibilities, lots of opportunities. Really good format, really good practice. I was happy to share it with you, and I appreciate any questions if you have some time left, or write me an email. I'd be happy to discuss that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dmytro. Dmytro Khutkyy. Well, the next, wait a minute, Dr. Marina Shentsova. From UNECE, this study suggests that the neoliberal paradigm in terms of ideas was applied in the CIS countries with different results. It is about the total autonomy of individuals and legal entities, citizens, and economic entities from the decisions of the state economic task. For example, please, Marina, can you begin?
Yes, it's nice to see all of you, and I hope you can hear me. I would like to start my presentation. Yes, so I'm hoping to start the slides. So I just need to find a way to start the slides. Yes.
Okay, that's better. Thank you.
And first of all, I would like to start with saying about the evolution of neoliberalism in former Soviet states. So at the beginning of the 90s, most countries which were part of the now former Soviet Union, they started to move towards democratic development. And there was a flow of such trends as new markets and electoral system. Also, the way that citizens could start their own businesses and collaborate with other countries. As we see the trend moving towards the 2000s, we have a bit of change because some countries which were which had the same start from the beginning, they changed to autocratic states. I would like to give an example that, for instance, most of the Central Asian countries like Kyrgyzstan and partially Kazakhstan, they started with free democracy, which changed for Kazakhstan into mostly autocratic regime up to nowadays. And for countries like Russia and Belarus, it's still mostly semi-autocratic, which means that the transition of power is not going smoothly. Sometimes there are often ways in which political leaders stay in power longer than 8 years, longer than 2 terms, and this shows that democracy is not really developed. As we look into the problems which encounter these countries from becoming democracies, I would like to state corruption, as usually it prevents economy from development and creates elites which often control the political circles and do not really develop towards democracy as well. And for countries which were part of Europe later, like Baltic states, they moved into democracy smoothly. They became the successors of the European democratic standards. Some countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan, they have shown a progress in elections. And for instance, in Kyrgyzstan, where I come from, as it was stated before, there were 2 revolutions which led to the overthrow of the previous presidents. But at the same time, it created more freedom for civil society. Because we see that there were governance of people who have chosen to change the system itself. But still, even those countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, which overcame revolutions, they suffered from corruption as well. And the way it works often makes it difficult for citizens to create better conditions for living, especially if you consider the way that positions in the government are being distributed among certain people and prevent others from taking part into democratic progress. The same way it goes for Belarus and Russia. which are mostly moving into totalitarian regime. Especially we can see example of Belarus recently, where the president is not capable of, let's say, move his term or resign when the people are certainly voting or protesting against him. Here I would like to show a small scale of such democratic institutions as elections, markets, and other freedoms. As you can see, some countries, like let's say again Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, they have better electoral systems. Still, they have some points lack of freedoms, where people can enjoy freedom of speech or freedom of using the information. So there are a few ways to improve conditions in which democracies develop. As you can see, we often have corrupt system of state, no free elections, and in some regions, like Central Asia, there is also external engagement or involvement, because there are often international donors which could influence the political processes, but it's not always open case. It just, let's say, it's like, let's say, the power which they have through investing certain groups or certain organizations on the local level. So here we can see the rights of the citizens. In order to have better electoral system, we need to have clear and open voting system. We need to create free speech and develop civil society initiatives, also provide more freedom to market players, and reduce control over business activities, which means that the state has less control over decisions of small and medium business companies. So that's basically all. I just stated the main problems existing with modern democracies, the former CIA states. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Okay. And the next Okay. Well, I'm very happy, and thank you. I wanted to say congratulations. I think that the science is more rich with your individual contribute. The debate about this subject, consolidation and deterioration of democracy, is an actual debate in all the world. Okay. Well, we have to end this session. Once again, thank you, you all panelists and the public. And I wish the continuation of a good work. Okay, thank you very much. And see you long or see you soon.
Thank you for this
Thank you,
session
thank
and
you,
everything.
thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Goodbye, goodbye.